Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics. This week we're looking at injustice and the role that blame should play in tackling it. Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Tackling injustice is one of the main motivations that many people have for getting involved in politics. Whether those injustices relate to income inequalities, the harms caused by climate change, discrimination based on gender or ethnicity, or failures to acknowledge each person's particular identity, most of us want to see change. But how best to achieve that? Well, some intriguing new research focuses on the role of blame. Political theorists have often been dubious of the merits of blame, seeing it as backward-looking and unduly negative. But Hannah McHugh, who is a PhD student here in the UCL Department of Political Science, argues that blame is due for something of a rehabilitation. And I'm delighted to say that Hannah joins us now, as does Dr. Avia Pasternak, Associate Professor in Political Theory in the department and a friend of the podcast, whose own work focuses in significant part on questions of moral responsibility. Hannah and Avia, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And Hannah, we're discussing today how to challenge injustice and negative power structures in society. Could you start maybe by giving some examples of situations that illustrate this? Where in our everyday lives do we encounter these kinds of dilemmas or moral questions that we're going to be talking about?
Certainly. So there's two cases which I'd like to begin by setting out, and I think we can refer back to these through the discussion. So these are both cases in which it might be unclear whether there's an appropriate role for blame or indeed for praise, which I'm sure we'll discuss also. Firstly, I think climate injustice is something which is prevalent in so many of our conversations in politics at the moment. And I think we can understand climate injustice as a kind of structural injustice. So structural injustices, an idea that was developed by the very prominent feminist theorist Iris Marion Young, are undeserved harms that are collectively produced through repeated behaviours and social practices of lots of different agents. And the actions on their own, which each agent maybe repeats or engages with, could be considered quote-unquote normal and therefore in some way not blameworthy. So we're increasingly aware of how our actions are contributing to climate injustice. For instance, maybe we drive every day to work or we're reliant on fossil fuels to heat our homes. And these actions on their own don't necessarily look blameworthy, but maybe we don't have any other option. I think there's a train strike today in the UK, for instance. I'm sure many of us are falling into this. An unjust outcome does follow from these supposedly innocuous actions. So perhaps the primary injustice here is that many of the world's poorest and least developed communities are going to suffer the worst impacts of climate change, despite having made the least contribution to that problem. But as I say, are we really to blame for that is the question which I'm looking to answer. Perhaps we could become vegan. We know this is contributing, meat production contributes to climate change, but we haven't taken that step. Are we to blame for that? And so another case then I would just like to bring out, which I think, again, we'll refer back to, looks a little bit different, but again, blameworthiness and praiseworthiness seem in dispute in some way. So we can imagine a scenario where new gender norms are emerging. So in that context, we have a non-binary identifying person, Sam, and Sam asks their colleagues to adopt non-gendered pronouns for them. So they specify that mistakes might happen, but they ask everyone to make an effort to adopt these non-binary pronouns when they address them at work. Some of the colleagues are kind of struggling to understand this. Maybe you have an older colleague who's not encountered non-binary persons before. Some colleagues make some mistakes initially, but they make a concerted effort, and others successfully adopt the practice. It probably looks like the plurality of what may go on. And we know that misgendering creates a level of distress for misgendered persons, and that is a kind of psychological harm, an individual psychological harm. But there's also a political harm going on here. So in a structural sense, if we take non-binary persons to be a marginalized group, and the harms of misgendering work to diminish the position of non-binary people, while concurrently elevating or making it appear the ordinary for gender-conforming people, then we have this more political element to that. So who has responsibility for that? Who is to blame in the sense of, can we blame the person in the office who perhaps just gets things a bit wrong for this social harm that seems to be flowing through these kinds of issues?
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you. So you've got two examples there, and I mean, strikingly different examples. The second one there, a very kind of personal, very kind of micro level in terms of where it happens in our lives. Not to suggest it's unimportant, but very much happening at the level of individual interactions. And climate change, meanwhile, something that often we think of, at least, as very much on the global scale. And I guess also they're quite different in the sense that I think everyone, well, perhaps not everyone, but the great majority of people, at least in a country like the UK, would agree that climate change is a problem and we need to tackle it, we need to take action. Whereas norms around gendering is an area that remains quite contested, and where there are kind of emerging norms, if you like, that have been developing in recent years about how we ought to interact with each other. So we're dealing with very different kinds of things here. Is that fair?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's an interesting difference in these cases which you bring out, which is the idea that sort of most people know in the case of climate injustice, they could be doing a little bit more. They know that it's something they couldn't do, but they're not taking up that responsibility. And that's clearly an aim, I think. Maybe Avi will have something to say on this, but I think an aim of an account of political responsibility is to try to motivate agents to take up those responsibilities, and in order to address those structures. So where we have something like climate change, where the norms are quite known, but perhaps we're not achieving them, we need to think about that in this context. But as you say, in the misgendering case, actually the norm itself is unclear. So we need some sort of account of responsibility, I would argue, including blame and praise, for reasons we'll come on to, that can actually reveal that standard and increase the uptake of that standard. So different cases, but both very structural in that sense. There's emerging ideas and development of how we tackle the structural effects of these actions.
So we're going to get on to the role of blame and praise, as you say, in addressing these injustices. But just before we do that, this focus on the role of praise and blame is the focus of one of the chapters of your PhD dissertation. But the dissertation as a whole looks at injustice much more broadly. What are the broad questions that you're seeking to address in the dissertation as a whole, just so that we can put the focus that we have today in context?
Certainly. So what interests me very much is this relationship between agents and structures. So today we're going to talk a lot about structural injustice, but what I focus on more in my thesis is the role of structural domination, which often is concurrent with structural injustice. But what is particular when we talk about structural domination is there's this focus on the power relationships that underlie certain injustices. So the normative problem in domination is that one agent or a group of agents has a power over another in a way that we don't find acceptable or just. So I look at these structural cases and try to say, well, which agents have this power and which agents don't? And I'm interested in quite contemporary cases. Structural domination was an idea that Marx used very often, talking about early capitalism. I look at later capitalism. So I have, for instance, looked at where structural domination might feature in a financial market. I'm also interested in how it might feature in online spaces and these new structures that we interact with. And this chapter comes in because one motivation of my account, or one motivation of my addressing these questions about agents and structures, is what do we do? How do we respond to these normative issues once we've identified them? So how can we, as individual citizens, be responsible for addressing injustice? So blame and praise has come in, for me, is to say, well, we are agents in structures, but are we really responsible in that sense of being fit for having the reactive attitudes that are associated with being blamed?
Great. So before we go any further, we're going to need to understand, what is blame? What do we actually mean when we use this word here? We think we understand it, but as I was reading through your chapter, the more I thought, gosh, do I actually understand what this word actually means, this very apparently simple word?
That speaks very much to my experience of researching blame. So moral philosophers have varying accounts of blameworthiness. So whether or not an agent is fit to be blamed. So they tend to converge on the basic idea that blame is a response to an agent for a perceived violation of a moral norm, and the blamer is taking that violated norm seriously. So blame has a kind of function. So it's a signal of a normative standard and a violation of that standard in practice. So I should probably qualify here before we go any deeper into that there's lots of things which as you allude to, we often call blame that perhaps actually aren't blame. So I wouldn't call scapegoating blame, because scapegoating doesn't involve that kind of violation of a standard. And there's another distinction here, which is that there is the act of blaming, which is a set of reactive attitudes, maybe resentment, indignation, or is expressed rather through reactive attitudes. And there is whether or not an agent is blameworthy. Are they the sort of agent to whom we could attribute these reactive attitudes such that would express blame or praise?
Avia, do you want to pick up on that?
Yes, thank you. So could you tell us a little bit more about what are the conditions under which we would blame somebody? When do we blame individuals?
Yeah, great. So traditionally, thinking about responsibility has focused very much on individual actions. So the agent's behavior, their actions, their attempts or their omissions. And these behaviors need to lead or result in some kind of wrongful event or condition. So we can call that causation. We also then have this idea that the behavior is prescribed or is violating some kind of moral requirement, so culpability. And that gives us a notion of blameworthiness. Did you meet these conditions for responsibility? If yes, then it looks like you're in some relevant moral sense to blame. But when we're now thinking about responsibility in collective contexts, it's not really clear whether any one individual really should be blamed for their actions. So we've actually had theorists such as Young, who I mentioned earlier, who finds that blame is really inappropriate. And I'd just like to note that while I'm critical of various aspects of what Young has said about blame and backwards-looking responsibility, my own work is largely derivative of hers, so I'm very, very indebted there. But in this structural case, we perhaps can't get the causal claim. And there's a few different reasons, which I think Avia will respond to your question. The idea that agents are perhaps too remote from the harm, they're too far away from the outcome. Their contribution might just be very minor. My emissions driving a diesel car don't actually put us to the tipping point of climate change. Someone else would have driven if I haven't. And perhaps there's a lack of intention to cause this injustice. In driving my car to work in the context of a rail strike, I don't intend for climate injustice to come about. So Young then follows what Arendt famously said, which is that where all are guilty, nobody is. So she thinks that guilt, like responsibility, is always, unlike responsibility rather, is always singling a person out. It's a sort of strictly personal liability. And I think we're going to come on to discuss those features I've mentioned there in the collective context to see if really they do hold up as only relevant for personal cases, or if we can respond to Young.
Thanks, Anna. So you described to us blame as, or being blameworthy, as somebody who, an agent who basically violated the moral norm in a way that caused some undeserved harm. And they did it with a state of mind that we consider culpable. So they did it recklessly or negligently or callously and so on and so forth. That sounds like the right definition that we commonly think about when we think about blame. But if we go back to the cases that we started with, the cases of climate change, harm, or misgendering, are we sure that these conditions are actually met, that it's appropriate to blame people in these contexts?
Yeah, great. So I think I want to begin by saying that I do start from the premise that there's something wrong with particular actions. So I am committed to saying that. I think it's a mistake if we are too formal or direct about the way in which harm has to be caused in these ways. So agents who act in a very minor way do contribute to these cumulative wrongs. So it may be true in a sense that when I take my diesel car out of the driveway and I go for a unnecessary weekend away, I don't intend to push us towards a climate tipping point. But that's a pretty thin defense, right? I'm at least reckless as to the possibility of contributing to such a point. And I'm playing an active role in producing and reproducing that injustice. But maybe I could seek some slightly better constructed defense and say that I don't see the precise impact of my behavior. So even if I left the car at home, someone else has driven anyway, and that's pushing us to the tipping point. But actually, I think drivers do come to be aware of the damage done by a way of life that is ignoring atmospheric effects. and therefore I think can become individually accountable for the unintended consequences of what they do when they act together. And I think key in grounding my claim there is to think a bit about Jung's own social connection model. So Jung thinks that we have responsibility in virtue of being socially connected in a structure, and we have a responsibility to transform that structure. So while I take agents to have an individual responsibility, it's not for the outcome of climate injustice exactly. It's for their role in the structure. It's for transforming that structure to try and improve or change or undermine the roles or processes that lead to the outcome. And for that, I don't think there's anything particularly indirect, actually. By having a role as an agent who drives a car recklessly, knowing of climate injustice, we're participating in that structure.
So if we go to the case of the misgendering, so there, it could be that I really didn't intend at all to, it's just a matter of habit that I'm used to calling my colleagues just using two genders, a male and female. And that's what I've done all my life. And, it's just a little bit, I feel, too hard to expect of me, one might argue, to constantly mind my language. I really didn't intend to harm anybody by using these two genders. So I'm very different from the person who recklessly goes around intentionally misgendering people in order to cause them discomfort and stress. Am I really to blame for just making this kind of honest mistakes, or just not quite being able to follow the rules, the new rules?
That's a very fair question. So I think I'd like to just say something again about the underlying structure before I respond to that. So in cases of structural injustice, as I've mentioned, we have structures which are to the benefit of some and to the disbenefit of others. And these structures are unchosen by particular individuals or agents, and we can't always get out of that structural position. So the person you describe who just doesn't really know about what's going on with kind of new emerging norms around gender and has been going about their job, they're in a kind of structural position, right? I can't change that I'm a white woman from a Western nation, nor any of the privilege or disadvantage that comes from that. So while structures are, to an extent, maintained by deliberate actions, they're also in many cases maintained by something else. Lots of these other actions that appear neutral within our social frameworks, given the position we find ourselves in. And I think that blame has a very useful role here, and I'll come on to why I think it's appropriate, but I think it's important to say why it's useful in this context, which is to show what the neutral assumptions are, supposedly neutral, and to challenge them, right? So I'm not saying blame and praise are all we need to get this structural change, but if transformation is a goal, I think that blame goes a very long way to getting to this. So you don't need agents in these positions to necessarily just act benevolently or charitably. You want to undermine the position in the structure, which actually means that there's a benefit and disbenefit in that system. So blame can reveal that power structure. So coming to the case of Sam and the misgendering, it might appear unclear what the morally right thing to do is. But by leveling blame at the right time in an appropriate way, we are actually revealing that emerging normative standard in a changing ecology of norms, in a situation where it is in some way unclear. We are showing that it is not in fact normal to misgender someone who is non-binary identifying. And blaming has this kind of very particular power that it can show that we're falling short, or an agent is falling short of an assumption in our moral or political expectations. And as I say, we're sort of immediately looking at a kind of privilege that's in that system. Now, it might be that the person enjoying that privilege, who perhaps is structurally in that position, they didn't choose to be, but they're not aware of these changing norms, feels quite affronted when others point out to them, oh, okay, actually, I find this a very blameworthy behavior. But we might compare that to those who are subjected to this privilege, who experience these systematic degradations of status, which has a structural effect. And I think ignoring these harmful speech acts can give a legitimating force to these assumptions, and again support the idea that they're part of a neutral structure, which is the thing we're directly trying to transform and change. And I would add to that as well, in terms of, are these agents fit to receive these kinds of reactive attitudes? Well, we can think about the work of Peter Strawson, who was a moral philosopher who wrote a very seminal essay on moral responsibility in 1967, I believe it was, in which he says that agents are fit for attributions of reactive attitudes if they are the type of agent who can be considered a moral agent. They can be engaged with on their social practices. And he finds in this context that, of course, there are types of agents which don't have the generic capacity. So agents who perhaps are blown by the wind into the road and cause a car to swerve, or had some sort of seizure while they were driving and cause an accident. We don't think those are the types of agents who we can apply responsibility to. But there are agents who we think we can engage with in these ways precisely because we consider them moral agents, and we're respecting that moral agency by deliberating with these agents about the type of actions that they engage in, about the social practices of which they are a form. So I actually think not to respond honestly based on the practice in which agents are participating, even if perhaps they've come from a structural privileged position, is to not respect that moral agency.
So you're arguing, if I can understand as a non-political theorist here, that blame is appropriate here because the agent is the sort of agent that makes blame justified, and it's also useful because actually the action of leveling blame, the action of actually saying that action was blameworthy, or you as an agent are blameworthy in this context, will lead to better outcomes. I guess I'm just wondering, Avia, you as a political theorist, how do you respond to that argument? Are there counter arguments to that you think we need to deal with here?
Yes, there are. I guess one follow-up question that I had in this context, I have two. So one of them, Hannah, is that you're describing structural injustice, which, as you said from the start, are very prevalent. In a way, almost all of us are in some way involved, say, in the injustice of contributing to climate change. I find it very hard unless I radically change my lifestyle, not to be in some way reliant on fossil fuels, even if I make some effort. So here my question is, who is doing the blaming then? I'm a person who, uses fossil fuels to heat my house. Can I come to you and tell you, why do you drive your car to work when you can take the train? After all, we have emerging moral norms. So you can point back at the finger at me and say, well, doesn't look like your house is quite in order in that respect. So isn't there a problem that if we are all part of it, there's nobody left to do the blaming?
That's very interesting. I see where that's coming from. I think that we need to have a maybe closer conversation then about what I think blaming and praising looks like in practice, right? So I think that hypocritical blame could land very poorly if we are all starting from a position of supposed moral righteousness. I don't think that's necessary to blame. I think you can have the conversation with your friend, which goes something like, I know that I shouldn't have bought this top at Primark. It's really terrible, but I have. And the other friend says, oh, I've been doing that as well. But you know what? I really think that's the good thing for us to do. There's a level of blame in this conversation. You can similarly, and I think this is maybe the more good news story, use praise in appropriate ways, right? So, it might appear initially very draconian to always be talking about blame. It feels like if blame is improperly used, it is very toxic. Undue blame, excessive blame. We're exhausting people's goodwill and hindering attempts to make social progress, so the thought goes. But we can use praise also to help these practices develop. So if we look at Sam's case again, why don't we consider the idea that actually you can praise the colleague who successfully adopts the practice? And praising, much like blaming, I think, helps us to develop our own ability to recognize the normative reasons which should apply to our own practices. So it's speaking to all the observers as well as to the people who are expressing or receiving blame and praise. Although I think I'd like to mention at this point as well that some tricky things can start to happen with blame and praise over time. So in our relationships, we need to moderate this in an appropriate way. So if we continue to praise over time the person who uses the gender-neutral pronouns, a different impact starts to emerge, and those agents actually start to look like they are exceptional in some sort of moral or normative sense, which actually starts to undermine the development of the emerging norm. So we need to see that while praise actually might decrease over time, blame might then increase over time. So it might be a small blame, a small conversation. Oh, actually, sorry, I had asked you to use my non-conforming pronoun and it seems like you forgot. Don't worry too much, but I appreciate it if you could change. That's a small blame. And over time, as praise decreases, more serious sanctions might appear in that context.
So there's a very prominent line, I think, in recent political theory that suggests that blaming is actually a counterproductive practice. So, for example, to call somebody racist is counterproductive because what it does, so the argument goes, gets the target of blame very defensive, offended, and doesn't really motivate them to try and change their behavior, because instead of actually engaging with the kind of this forward-looking process of change, what they do is kind of try to kind of exonerate themselves or deflect the blame or deny that they've done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, blame gets a reputation of getting people less politically involved and less open to change than models that just say, well, you know, everybody does it, but we should all try and change, or something, kind of moving away from blame. So I just wondered what your thoughts about these kind of pragmatic concerns about the connection between blame and political action.
Certainly. And I think in order to respond properly to this claim about motivation, I need to set out for you two key features that I see in blame and how they operate in the context of improving motivation, and some issues with, I think, that claim. So two features of blame which I think are very, very important are, we could call these the signaling and the scaffolding features of blame. So I'll set out each in turn. So first, the signaling function. When we blame someone, it's not just a process of holding someone accountable, it's also giving off certain signals about what is morally or normatively correct in this group. So when we do this, it's actually quite costly to the blamer, right? So it costs the blamer in emotional energy, in their time. It could be suggesting to the detriment of some relationships, but yet we still do that. Now, I follow some recent philosophers who've written on this topic, Shoemaker and Vargas quite noticeably, and it seems that we do this partly because we're signaling our commitment to a social group. So social groups involve very wide-ranging, sometimes subtle, and constantly evolving interpersonal and structural norms. So there's certain social advantages that we have when we blame, because we indicate to the group that we believe in the norms of the group and we reliably identify those social norms, and agents over time have more trust in us. But there's actually more than that. The practice of blaming and praising too is indicating what the normative standards of the day are in the context that they're changing. So when we call out wrongful behavior, we make clear that that behavior is wrongful. Now, what I think is really key in answering to your question is that this signal does not just go to the blamed person, but it goes to all of the observers, all of the people in the social group. So I actually might accept what you say, that there's plenty of social psychological evidence about some of the risks of blaming on the blamed, but I don't see them as the only target. I see that we have an evolving kind of normative ecology in which we are choosing our own reasons for actions and understanding our own standards within our social group. So that leads me quite nicely on to the second feature of blaming, which I think is very key, which, as I say, we could call a kind of scaffolding. So one thing we want to do in these kinds of political cases, as you say, relates to motivation. So we want to get agents to take up their responsibility. So unlike in the misgendering case, there are actually cases, climate change, where it seems like most agents actually are clear on the facts around their role in structural injustice, right? So as I mentioned at the start, we know that climate injustice is unfolding, and most of us know we could be doing a lot more. I could cycle more, I could be vegan, these sorts of things we think about for ourselves. Now, whether or not an agent chooses to take that course of action, to take up that responsibility, depends on much more than just the idea of whether they know of the facts around this, But actually, we have to make the decision internally to select that particular reason. Now, I think that blaming and praising really helps us to scaffold these abilities, to change the normative environment so that we apply weight to those particular reasons and consider them worthy of us selecting them. And this is actually an issue, I think, which comes up in Young's account, which she excludes backwards looking kinds of responsibilities, we said, because I don't think she is paying quite enough attention to the responsiveness to reasons we need in this kind of sense. So if for her, she says that there is no backwards looking responsibility, only a forward looking one to address the structure, well, if that forward looking responsibility is never taken up, and then the agent is never blamed for not taking up that responsibility, it's not clear to me that that actually increases motivation. So while particular agents might be affected by being blamed, a wider thing happens, which is that it develops this normative ecology in which more agents understand that they could take those sorts of actions, and indeed, I think, do.
So we're very much coming to the end of our time here, alas. Maybe a final very quick question from me, and perhaps if there's time, Avia, a final quick question from you as well. So from me, particularly the first of your points there about signalling made me think, is there a difference between blaming people in our own group and blaming others? And it strikes me that the kind of harmful blame that Avia was talking about there and the danger of defensiveness is often associated where we see one group that likes to blame another group. And actually, it's not a costly action to blame because it's an affirmation of our own group identity to blame others as being morally inferior from us. And it feels to me that quite often we have in our society at the moment rather a lot of judgment going on, actually, and a lot of judgment of people in the on the other political side as being somehow morally deficient. But you're focusing very much on blame within the group, blame among friends, that kind of thing. So is that the appropriate location for blame? Should we be worried about blame of others in a way that we shouldn't worry about blame within a group?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And I think what's really important in all of these scenarios is that what's key in these structural cases is to understand or to have an awareness of particular agents' power positions. Now, I think it can be appropriate to blame across groups. In fact, I think one of the strange features of this, or perhaps uncomfortable features, that often the victim of the injustice will be the first to know about the injustice and must levy that blame, which is an uncomfortable truth in the power dynamic that we might see. But perhaps something else to think about this is that if we accept many standards appear neutral and are not, we must also accept that we should be engaged with and deliberated with about our own practices and how they look in these supposedly neutral but perhaps unjust structures, and be open to receiving these kinds of criticisms and these types of blames. Now, I think I mentioned already that I think Twitter-style blame falls short very often of these sorts of standards of how we can engage in these conversations, in these practices. I think also blame might be undermined where it's tied to undue kinds of blame, one group who typically always blames another. But I think there's something in the idea of punching up, not down, which can be valuable provided that other agents come in and support. And I think that's something that if we see ourselves as responsible for transforming our position, we should see ourselves as having a responsibility, a political responsibility to do. Now, within our own social group, we might just carry more leverage and more weight to begin these conversations at times. But I couldn't say that that's a more important role. I think we need to see ourselves as having power positions in structures, and we have reason to support people from all parts of the structure and to reconsider our own positions too.
Final thought from Avia?
So we spoke a lot about the role that blame plays for the target of blame, how it might motivate them, how it might help them better understand the new norms that are emerging in our society. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the impact that blaming has for the blaming agent. So if we go back to the example of Sam, who encounters a colleague that, let's say, repeatedly misgenders them. And I guess your account suggests to us that Sam would be right in expressing resentment, maybe anger, at the person who misgenders them, and that would be an appropriate response. Do you think that this kind of response also serves some function for some themselves, that some also would benefit from, let's say, license to blame?
I think that it's important that we see this as a moment in which we are revealing the non-neutrality of some of these acts, and that can be a real reclamation of space and of status from the person who is levying this blame. Now, something I would also like to say is that in Sam's case, Sam has the capacity to levy that blame. We can think of other structural injustices where perhaps workers on a sweatshop floor don't have the space to reclaim through blaming practices. And what's key here is that many agents interact in these structures, and it may be that the victim is the first to understand the scenario and the first to levy the blame, and others should support. And that can be empowering to the victim. But that transformation, which seeks to empower the victim and perhaps disempower those with the most benefit or power in the structure, may actually have to start from more peripheral agents. It may have to start from us as buyers of fast fashion, as us as drivers of diesel cars, seeing the practices and speaking on the behalf of other agents in seeking to do that.
We could continue this conversation for a lot longer. I think it's really great stuff and fascinating and so important as well. Thank you so much, Hannah and Avia, for bringing this to us. So we've been discussing the role of blame in politics with Hannah McHugh and Dr. Avia Pasternak. Hannah, best of luck for completing your PhD study. Listeners can't read your work on this just yet, but I'm sure we'll see excellent publications on this topic from you very soon. And if listeners would like to read Avia's work, her book, Responsible Citizens, Irresponsible States, Should Citizens Pay for Their State's Wrongdoings, was published by Oxford University Press last year. And if you go back to May of last year, you can find an episode of UCL Uncovering Politics with Avia focusing on the ethics of violent protest. This is the last episode of UCL Uncovering Politics for this term. So thank you so much to all of you for listening in over recent months. We'll be hard at work over the summer doing lots more research, and we look forward very much to discussing some of it in our next podcast series starting in October. So do please join us then. Remember, to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Riddick. This episode was researched by Connor Kelly and produced by James Cleaver. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.